As climate change opens up the Northwest Passage, concerns are being raised about Canada's claim to the region. China has already called it a golden waterway for trade, while the U.S. argues the passage is part of international waters. So what could this mean as the Arctic becomes more economically valuable? Joining me from Vancouver is Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law, Michael Byers. Michael, thanks for joining us this morning. The business case seems to make itself. Sending cargo from Europe to Asia shaves off 4,000 kilometers from travel compared to the Panama Canal. What economic benefits does Canada possibly stand to gain here?
Well, Canada does not stand to gain much from the long-distance international cargo voyages because those ships would not be stopping on the way. And yet Canada could incur significant costs because we'd have to provide a better search and rescue. We'd have to provide ports of refuge, improved aids to navigation. So the long-distance cargo voyages are actually a challenge and not an opportunity. There will be opportunities in terms of easier access to northern communities, to provide supplies to residents, access to mines, access for tourists. But the long-distance cargo shipments are actually a burden.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned mines because the Arctic contains 13% of the world's remaining undiscovered oil, as much as 30% of its natural gas deposits. That's drawing a lot of attention. As we said, the United States is calling the Northwest Passage international waters. China's trying to lay claim to it, although they're not an Arctic country to begin with, so I find that's a whole other conversation. But I guess the question is, if the economic benefits aren't necessarily there, what are the consequences to Canadian sovereignty?
Well, the consequences to Canadian sovereignty are that our long-standing dispute with the United States could come back into focus as the amount of shipping increases. Way back in 1988, we signed an agreement with the United States that essentially put the dispute to one side. The U.S. agreed to ask permission for any voyages by its icebreakers, and we agreed to give permission in advance. So we essentially agreed to disagree, and that would have been fine if it were not for the advance of climate change. So since 1988, we've lost over 30% of the Arctic sea ice, and that is the problem, that long-standing dispute could come back into play, which is why I've been arguing for a number of years that we need to re-engage with the United States on this issue and address the challenges that face both countries in terms of security, in terms of search and rescue in the Northwest Passage.
Michael, do we have the resources, the skills, the manpower to defend that area, to respond to crises up there if there were humanitarian issues, if there were environmental spills? Are we capable of taking on this responsibility as a nation?
Well, we do have some resources. We have very good long-range search and rescue helicopters. The problem is that they're based on Vancouver Island and in Nova Scotia. They're a long way away from the Northwest Passage. And we have, of course, the communities in our Arctic and the residents of those communities, including many Canadian Rangers who provide pretty good search and rescue coverage around those communities. So there are some abilities, but we need to improve them. I think we need to deploy one of our search and rescue helicopters to the Arctic in the summer months to provide a faster response, for instance, and we need to recapitalize our Canadian Coast Guard icebreaker fleet.
Michael Byers, thank you so much for bringing this into focus for us. We appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Thank you.